Welcome everyone to our panel today on the state of the evidence in interreligious action. I'm very happy to welcome you, and we'll just get going. I think we'll probably have more people joining as we go on, but we're all here and ready to start, so we will start. So my name is Olivia Wilkinson. I'm the Director of Research at the Joint Learning Initiative on Faith and Local Communities, known as the JLI. The JLI is an international network focused on evidence around religions and development. And as a joint learning network focused on evidence, we're often asked to summarize the evidence on a topic related to religions in international affairs generally. And so while it may seem like a simple request sometimes just to summarize the evidence, it's actually very complex because we're dealing with this intersection of religions with humanitarianism, development, peace, and everything that those topics may be connected to as well. So about 2 years ago, we started working on a state of the evidence project that we've now been able to publish this year. And the state of the evidence report is our go-to document that gives up-to-date summaries on religions, humanitarianism, development, and peace. One of the chapters in the report specifically focuses on peace and conflict, and Susie Hayward is here today to introduce that chapter to you shortly. The rest of our session will then include discussion amongst our respondents on the state of the evidence in interreligious action. So our kind of overarching question is, what is the state of the evidence in interreligious action? Is it sufficient? Where are the gaps? What more information do we need to help give us a rounded picture of the evidence on interreligious action? So in my opinion, the state of the evidence in relation again to religions, humanitarianism, development and peace, or HDP, has greatly increased and improved over the last decade or so, but there are still many, many gaps remaining and questions left unanswered. And so that's what we'll be discussing a bit more today. Our panelists joining us, or roundtable panelists, I should say, joining us today, are Susie Hayward, who's the Associate Director for the Religious Literacy and the Professions Initiative at Religion and Public Life at Harvard Divinity School. Anna Marie Dow, who's the Head of Research and Courses Unit at the Adyan Foundation. And Professor Mohammed Abu Nimr, who of the International Peace and Conflict Resolution Program at American University. You can, I think, find on the website their fuller bios with more information about their backgrounds, but those are the headline titles for now. So yes, as I said, the beginning of the session we'll hear from Susie about the state of the evidence chapter on peace and conflict, and then we'll break into discussion, and we have some questions for our panelists about this question of the state of the evidence in interreligious action. So I will now hand over to Susie to start us off. Thanks.
Thank you, Olivia, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody, and thanks for inviting me to be a part of this discussion and the broader summit. It's great to see how this gathering is complementing and building on the last summit, focusing on strategic religious engagement, and I'm heartened to be back with so many of my beloved colleagues from my time with the U.S. Institute of Peace in Washington, D.C. I miss everybody there, but I am grateful to still be able to engage with folks from Cambridge. So as Olivia mentioned, together with the illimitable Dr. Erin Wilson, who's based in the Netherlands, I wrote for JLI this broad scope of the trajectory of scholarship and practice related to religion, violence, and peace last year. And I will summarize it here. I do want to note from the outset that the paper did not focus in particular on interreligious relations or interreligious action, but I'm going to pull some of those implications out in what I provide here to set us up for the subsequent discussion. And apologies to those for whom some of this retrospective will be covering well-trod ground that you know well. Broadly, over the past few decades, we have seen scholarship and practice in peace building bring religion into the frame of consideration with far more intentionality than previously and in the previous century, particularly in the West. The attempt to correct what was diagnosed as a lack of nuanced consideration of religious dimensions shaping conflict and peace dynamics, or the sort of knee-jerk negative assumption about the influence of religion, that knee-jerk negative assumption is a result of European Enlightenment norms and assumptions that accompanied the rise of the modern secular defined state. This correction of that negative presumption or of the lack of attention to religion initially led to an overcorrection, an overemphasis, Dr. Wilson and I argue, on religion and on its positive contributions. That is, for a time, the research on religions, conflict, and peace overemphasized religion as the crucial element for understanding conflict situations and tended to focus more on the positive contributions of religious ideas, actors, and organizations as an underutilized resource for peace building. So this led to work and practice that highlighted peace building ideas and practices within different religious traditions, particularly Christianity and Islam. Muhammad Abu Nimr here wrote a wonderful book on Islamic resources for peace building and nonviolence during this time. And in the 1990s, in response to a good many internal conflicts, there was, relevant for what we're focusing on here, a focus on interreligious dialogue and relationship building across conflict lines in places like Israel, Palestine, Sri Lanka, Nigeria, the former Yugoslavia, Sudan, and elsewhere. These efforts were extremely helpful in balancing out the dominant assumptions about religion as an inherently negative force that were dominant within the international system and within dominant conflict resolution theory and practice, particularly in the West. But this work often reified understandings of religion as a distinct and autonomous aspect of society and culture, rather than seeing religion as inevitably entangled with other dimensions of political, economic, and social life. So it still tended to emphasize religion as a sector, a distinct sector of society, rather than seeing the ways in which it's mutually constructed by and entangled with, inevitably, with political and other social, economic, and so on factors. There was also not always a lot of critical consideration of the consequences of the work in this emerging space of religious peace building, much less evaluation as we're discussing it today. So as just one example, the gendered assumptions and considerations that were shaping dominant religious or interreligious work was not always adequately considered, with the consequence that oftentimes this early religious, or again, interreligious peace building work, often reinforced gender inequalities and forms of gendered violence. We saw another shift as well during this time that was relevant to our discussion, noting the limitations of purely person-to-person interfaith dialogue projects for reforming structural injustices and the need to bridge conflict within religious communities. The field came to emphasize the relationship between dialogue and action. And I recognize that the framing for our summit today is on interreligious action for peace. As well as there was an emphasis as well as the need for intra as well as intergroup bridge building to create broader mobilization. So over the past decade, there has been an increasing rejection of grand narratives about religion and violence and religion and peace. Instead, new approaches have sought to really embed research and programming on religions, conflict, and peace within specific contexts, with attention to the nuances and complexities within different religious communities and traditions, as well as the diverse ways that religions are entangled with gender, politics, economics, culture, so on, in any given context. The happy result of this is contextually grounded intersectional analysis of the relationships among different aspects of the category of religion and conflict, violence, extremism, peace, and so on. So Dr. Wilson and I see this as a helpful turn for many reasons. Among other things, it coincides with and reinforces the turn towards localization or decolonization of development and aid work. It's not about making broad sweeping generalizations about religions being violent or religions being peaceful in particular ways, but but about really looking in specific cultural context, the ways in which what we think of as religion is entangled with and shaping different kinds of conflict or development dynamics and needs. It also disrupts assumptions about what constitutes the religious. So it moves us away from only defining the religion based on institutional representations of religion, for example, that focus exclusively on formal religious clerics or formal religious bodies as the sole or authentic representation of religion that determines religious interpretations and behaviors in response to conflict issues. So by going into that contextual, that local, to ask these questions about how what we understand as religion is shaping things, it pushes us as well, not just to both listen to local actors and to look at the complexities of the local landscape about how religions are showing up in ways that are helpful, but it also expands our aperture of how religious influence is shaping it and about what constitutes religious influence, which is often far more messy than just formal institutionalized. A look at formal religious institutions will show us, or even or formalized faith-based organizations that are operating like NGOs and so on. So we assert with these moves that have brought religion more into focus, that has allowed these religious peace building and interreligious peace building efforts to become increasingly mainstreams. And some of the examples we give for this are major peace building organizations, INGOs like Search for Common Ground, dedicated to looking at religious engagement and including religious engagement as part of their peace building work. And I'm glad we'll have Sharon Rosen speaking later today, who is the religious engagement director for Search, as well as numerous foreign ministries who are integrating religious literacy programs for their diplomats and programs for religious engagement as part of their foreign policy practice. So in the earlier panel, we had GIZ represented, but you see a number of different foreign ministries, particularly in the West, who are kind of creating either programs or point people who are looking at these questions of religion broadly within peace building and development and more largely. And there's increasing calls to ensure that these efforts are not siloed as a niche field, but are better integrated within larger projects, part of multi-sectoral approaches. Those are all positive things. I will note, or we noted, Dr. Wilson and I in this overview, that the rise of the subfield of countering violent extremism and the related focus on religious freedom promotion as an antidote to religiously framed violent extremism, that about 10 years ago, that sort of resurfaced some antiquated understandings of religion and practices of engagement of religion, while simultaneously funding far more initiatives in this space. So where the increase in programming is accompanied with critical reflection on the shortcomings of previous religious peace building work to build on hard-earned lessons, this can be helpful. Though I will note that some scholars worry that the field has regressed to overemphasizing religion as a determinant of violence or peace. An additional change that we've seen over the past 10 years has been attention to even more religious traditions and worldviews than previously considered. So the early emergence of the field in the 1990s tended to focus on Christianity, Islam, to a lesser extent Judaism, and then increasingly to Buddhism and Hinduism, although many still argue that there's not enough attention to Buddhism and Hinduism or other Asian religions. In recent years, though, we've also seen a greater intentional turn towards inclusion of indigenous traditions worldwide. And this, coupled with, I think, greater appreciation for the internal complexity and dynamism of the so-called major world religions, has introduced far more complex understandings of the very category of religion that we're using in this space of scholarship and practices, particularly because indigenous traditions, they don't always neatly fit into the colonial category of religion. And moreover, their presence highlights how uncritical interreligious work can unintentionally reinforce broader social power inequalities between communities, particularly when the religions that are overrepresented in these efforts are the ones that the international community has an easier time engaging, which is oftentimes more highly institutionalized traditions like Catholicism or some forms of Buddhism, or faith-based NGOs that operate in ways that are familiar, that sort of mimic secular defined NGOs. So on evaluation specifically in this space, Dr. Wilson and I noted that there have been some efforts, as Olivia said at the outset, there's been some efforts to enhance evaluation of religious peace building that have come up with a special rubric for evaluating these projects. And this has been in response to concerns that earlier projects' successes had been primarily anecdotal rather than empirical. So Alliance for Peace Building, one of our hosts here today, they sought to create some specific rubrics for evaluating interfaith action that was supported by GHR Foundation. And these moves are helpful in ensuring that there is critical reflection of this work, particularly of its unintended consequences, to ensure their constructive impact. They're also helpful in ensuring that these efforts don't reinforce power dynamics between communities that are unequal. And I mean not just dynamics between different religious communities, but between different genders, between different educational levels or socioeconomic levels, between different generations, and so on. So helpful to ensure that the ways in which religious peace building is being, and interreligious action is being advanced is really addressing some of the cultural, structural, systemic forms of discrimination and violence that are often at the heart of violent conflict. And these efforts have been helpful in thinking about their impact, these projects' impact on multiple forms of violence, including those cultural, structural, and overt. However, one concern we raised in this overview is that these efforts have also resurfaced some of these long unresolved debates about the very idea of religion being something that's sui generis, something that's distinct and different, that requires that evaluation of religious peace building be done in some way that is distinctive from what we understand to be secular peace building. So we expressed some concern that frankly, that such approaches may also continue to subtly reinforce the separation of what we define as secular actors and activities from religious actors and activities in ways that can privilege the secular over the religious, demanding that religious actors and approaches continually demonstrate their added value to established secular peace building frameworks. So as in all of this, and I hope this has come across in everything I said, there's this need to continue to walk these fine lines to ensure both that we're recognizing the distinct contributions of dimensions of religion in this work and thinking critically about how this work is being designed and what impact it's having, both that intended and that unintended. But nonetheless doing so in a way that's not unintentionally reinforcing problematic binaries and distinctions in power dynamics. So thank you, everybody. That was a very sort of broad take over several decades of really rich scholarship and practice that is necessarily making some very broad brushstrokes, but I'm looking forward to getting into some more of the particularities in the discussion and to hearing from my colleagues here.
Thank you ever so much, Susie. So you can find the chapter that Susie's just spoken about with the references, all the different materials that Susie and Erin used to construct that chapter in the link that Saurav posted in our chat. The State of the Evidence on Religions and Development. It's chapter 6. So I have also recognized that we've got a bit of a tension here in forcing ourselves to speak of the state of the evidence. We're talking about these kind of grand narratives that actually, Susie's just pointed out, a lot of the evidence, the research, the learning is trying to move away from to the more contextualized approach. So, you know, we're not trying necessarily to create a one-time and only picture of the state of the evidence. There's lots that need to be considered and brought into the picture. So hopefully we can do that a little bit more in our discussions now. Our first question that I'll pose, well, I can see that you're unmuted, Professor Mohammed Abu-Nimr, so we'll go to you first, and then we will go to Anna Maria Dow second. So we'll then reverse that when we go to the next questions. And if Susie has anything to add at the end, we'll come to you, Susie. Okay, So our first question is the headline, the opening question of what is your opinion on the state of the evidence on the effectiveness of engaging with multi or interreligious actors? We want to know, do you think there's a paucity of evidence? We often get challenged by this idea that there's not enough evidence. Or do you think we have a solid state of the evidence now that we can work with? So what's your headline idea about the current state of the evidence on interreligious action? Over to you, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you, Olivia. Thank you for the, again, including and the invitation to be part of this conversation today. It's always a pleasure to be part of this discussion as well. Thanks for the Alliance for holding this meeting, as well as good to be with both Anna and Susie again in looking at this field as well. I guess, you know, the macro wider answer is, as Susan indicated, obviously, yes, we have more evidence now, concrete evidence, whether it is case studies or quantitative and qualitative data to support the argument and the hypothesis that religious and interreligious efforts to respond to war, violence, and to development are effective, and more than what we had in the 90s, more than what we had in the 80s, definitely, and more than I think, you know, that we had in early 2000 after 9/11. There is no doubt we have more. Whether the question we will ever have enough to persuade policymakers, donors, and the general public that religion is not the sole primary factor or agency that cause violence, I doubt it. And also I doubt that whether we will have ever enough evidence to convince those who think that secular, particularly secular agencies and agents who think that religion and faith has nothing to do with policy making and should be kept outside, which is the typical I should say, you know, secular view that many IGO, international governmental organization take, or also some governments take, in particular governments in the Northern Hemisphere who have been consistently in the lead or in the support of such argument of negating the effect and the role of faith in peacemaking, or in on the contrary, focusing on the violent aspect. So that's my general response. But I want to also add one more point. I think the question is, we have to be more nuanced when we deal with the humanitarian development and peace activist or activity. I think when we deal with interreligious work in development and humanitarian work, that's significantly, in my view, different than the interreligious peace building and dialogue. Those are two different fields. I mean, there's some similarities and overlap, but we should distinguish between them simply because the scope and the mandate and the size of the work of Islamic Relief or Catholic Relief Services or World Vision or the, you know, one of these the big faith-based development organization, and their networks are far more advanced, far more developed, and they have their own evaluation, and they have their own methods as well. And I think they're far more rooted in working in many parts of the world than the interreligious peace building and interreligious dialogue, which I think is more emerging, as Susan indicated in her input. So I just would caution us from lumping those two together and continue to think about the nuances in each one of them. That would be my initial response without necessarily going further. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. Well, we will have time to go further too in the next questions, but over to you now, Anna Maria, for your response.
Thank you, Olivia, and thank you for having me. I do agree with Professor Muhammad that the research on the state of evidence has increased in the past decade. However, I still think that it is limited in nature. And based on the work that we have been doing at Adyan recently, I think that sometimes it does not necessarily reflect reality from the ground, and sometimes is developed from a Western or donor or international organization perspective. And I do believe that research that is not participatory or inclusive in nature does not yield genuine results and does not shed light on the actual needs of a certain community. I do also agree with Professor Mohammed that there is a need to separate between humanitarian and development work of interreligious religious institutions and faith-based activists and peace activities. However, I would like to add on that and see that it is also important for us to understand the connection between both. Because if I'm giving an example from the Middle East, those two are related. So when faith organizations are working on developing a certain community, access to water, to healthcare, education, job opportunities, then this sometimes ties back to conflict resolution and peace activities. So it's important, of course, to understand the nuances, but also the relationship between both. So I just wanted to highlight that. And I would summarize the situation of the state of evidence in general as follows. As I said, I do believe that it is increasing in nature, but I think it is still limited to small-scale research and the sharing of best practices. And I've had the chance to look quickly over the publication of Dr. Abu Nimr, which is amazing, the Evaluating Interreligious Dialogue and Peace Building, as well as I was part of the Compendium of Best Practices by JLI, which was published in 2021. So those are great resources. However, they do and could be first steps in could be one of the first steps in developing the state of evidence. The second, how I would also describe the state of evidence is, as I said, limited in its participatory and inclusive approach, meaning that faith-based actors are not always involved in developing the methodologies or involved in conducting the research. And I think sometimes we do not have enough support or examples from, I hate this categorization, but countries of the South, because sometimes we do use language and narratives that are not easily understood or accessible to all of the communities. And I think we can go more into details regarding this last point in the following question.
Thank you very much, Anna Maria. Susie, anything to add for that question?
Sure. Thanks, Olivia, and thanks both Anna Maria and Mohammed. I agree that it's better than it was, and we have a long way to go. And particularly, I'm glad that Anna Maria brought up the point that who is determining what success is, and to what degree are we ensuring that those on the ground are determining what success looks like with respect to humanitarian goals, reconciliation, peace, whatever it is. Discrimination, justice in particular is an important one, that different groups are going to have different understandings of what success looks like with respect to justice. And so who is setting the standards for what we're evaluating impact against is incredibly important. And that participatory work of doing evaluation, I think we have a long way to go across the board generally, but in this particular subfield as well. One thing I'll just note that I recall from the last summit and the work that was done by Catherine Marshall-Crisipal and others, and sort of reviewing the evidence of religious engagement, not with a particular focus on multi-religious, although that was included within some of the sweeping reviews that they did of what's out there, is they found that there was also, where you found more evidence and evaluations that were done of this kind of work, it tended to be in particular geographic areas and with respect to particular religions or particular faith-based organizations that represented particular religions. And my recollection is that it was a lot. The geographic focus was often in Africa, different kinds of initiatives from Africa, and that there was a preponderance of Christian organizations that were doing the forms of evaluation that produced the kind of evidence that was considered valuable and that was lifted up in some of these publications and these studies. So they also noticed this gap in certain regions and across certain religious traditions. And again, I think this reflects back as well, especially the focus on or the overemphasis, or maybe not overemphasis, but the reality that we have more of this kind of evidence that the international system recognizes and considers valuable coming from Christian faith-based organizations in particular also reflects a little bit of what I was saying at the outset, that we tend to look at and engage the kinds of faith-based organizations in this space that operate like and are easier to engage with the international system, or easier to be engaged by the international system, because they're already operating in ways that are recognizable, and the ways in which they're determining success, evaluating success, and so on, meets the standards of the international community. There's a lot more that we could say within that, but I'll just stop there for now.
Thanks. Well, this is getting us well into the debate already. I love this. So our next question leads from that, and it really is the question of what is evidence? Particularly, we wanted to look at what is the difference between how donors and then how interreligious actors perceive and understand what evidence is, what evidence counts, this picture of research and learning that goes towards an evidence base. And you've already talked about a little bit of who gets to define what evidence is. And these are the questions that we're tackling and dealing with in creating a picture of the state of the evidence. I said I'd reverse our order, but then Susie's just spoken. So let Anna Maria, if you can lead off of this question of, what is the evidence and how do different donors, interreligious actors perceive it?
Of course. I just want to clarify that mostly when I'm answering taking the Middle Eastern, North African, so the MENA perspective into consideration. And another great initiative that JLI started this year, which is one among many, the Middle East Hub on Monitoring, Evaluation, Accountability, and Learning, that joins different faith-based actors and institutions together to share their experiences on monitoring, evaluation, to discuss what is evidence and to discuss how it can be improved. Prior to that, we had several listening dialogues in Lebanon and other countries in the Middle East, such as Iraq and Syria. And one of the main highlights in these dialogues is that there is a difference between how those faith-based actors or interreligious organizations, local interreligious organizations define evidence, and on agreeing what is labeled as evidence between them and their international partners or donors. And some of them said that while faith-based actors consider that the needs they identify through their daily work and the results they collect from the initiatives they implement and their analysis of the overall feel of their community is considered as evidence, while other international organizations and donors might sometimes stick to their preset framework of criteria on what is considered as evidence and what is not. And they particularly, for example, gave an example of this large focus on percentages, such as the participation of women or people with disability or children. So there is this focus on numbers, on percentages. However, those are not on their own, of course, always indicative of results, gaps, or success stories. So these percentages should be complemented by other forms of evidence, such as the success stories, stories of change, anything that they could collect through outcome harvesting or through dialogue and focus groups. They also said that some indicators and methodologies that work in certain countries, specifically in the West, do not necessarily work in other contexts because, as Susan said, each country has its own nuances and specifications for data collection. And based on the feedback of several participants in the Lebanese dialogue as well, it is important to find a balance between setting an overall evaluation framework in collaboration. So with the participation of faith-based actors and institutions, and validating information or data through them. So the framework is of course important as long as they are involved in setting it and taking their analysis and their point of view, while also taking into consideration that there are biases, is important as well to ensure the sustainability of the implemented project.
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing the listening dialogues up as well, Anna Maria. That's great. And of course, very direct opinions on all these problems with this word evidence and who gets to define it. Okay, Professor, over to you there.
Thank you, Anna, as well for again touching upon these points. I've also took note of them, planning to address some of them, so I'll comment on some of them, but maybe outside also from the MENA region. You know, sorry. In general, as I said earlier, the primary bias against interreligious peace building and interreligious dialogue programs is really as different from the development, mainly, and humanitarian relief, is really this, in my view, obsession with the quantitative log frame measures that basically try to quantify everything and every success and every criteria. And I have been in, almost, tens of evaluation throughout the past decades or so. The last one was about a month ago. We did an evaluation for Salam Institute work in Nigeria, in Cameroon and Chad, for 2 years work of education in madrasa school, Islamic education, religious education in madrasa schools. And donor wise, the perspective was that we want to do only quantitative design, even a quantitative experimental design, versus the people who taught, were on the ground, who done the work. These numbers did not mean much to them, and what they wanted to include was, as Anna said, the stories, the success, the examples, how did it affect their life, the quality, the story, the narrative that has a change in the class, the examples, which usually only captured by the different qualitative methods in that sense. So I think that's a major aspect. And this is a donor perspective. And in many ways, even beyond donors, it's a policymaker's emphasis on saying, we want to see concrete evidence for the money we're putting in particular in the Southern Hemisphere, or also in general, in order to be able to use it for local politics or domestic policy argument. So that's one major aspect. A second one I wanted to point out is that the field of interreligious peace building is underfunded relatively to the humanitarian and also the others. But in particular, for this field, to conduct an evaluation, long-term design evaluation that is about 10 years to track and to trace evidence is a necessity in many ways. And I think that's something that absent from the work. For the donor, that's not necessary. But I think from the perspective of both, genuine evaluation and some design that can generate long-term evidence, I think that is much needed. You could see the vulnerability of the interreligious peace building evaluation and work during the COVID time, when funding shrank significantly in that area and was also increased in other areas of health and maybe education. But again, I think you've seen the 14 cases or so that we mentioned. I think Anna referred to them, a book on evaluating interreligious peace building. And all the cases, all the contributor in this book, pointed out for the difficulty of getting the writ large evaluation impact, meaning providing evidence that their work, their project, their intervention has significantly changed or causally changed the reduction of violence in the country, or brought peace to the ongoing protracted conflict in Sri Lanka, Mindanao, Philippines, or Lebanon, or Palestine, Israel, or any other ongoing conflict. It's highly difficult from the perspective of the practitioner to provide impact on a long-term, with large a kind of a macro level change. So the suggestion in these cases, and I'll stop after this point, the suggestion in these cases is that our criteria of success in evaluation from interreligious peace building should go not only be on the writ large, on the macro level, but should be also shifting and focusing more on the both subjective story, the narrative change, as well as the institutional and community level shifts that took place. And to be able to detect that criteria-wise, you have to be there more than 2 weeks to do evaluation, and more than 1 or 2 trips throughout the year, in order to understand the importance of one pastor or one imam making a public statement about peace building in their community. To understand the meaning of that, you need to understand the contextual dynamic, rather than say, yes, they only made one statement quantitatively. I'll stop here and maybe come back later to a couple of other points. Thank you.
Thank you, Susie.
Yeah, I mean, I want to reinforce a couple of things that Mohammed said. One, I would have started exactly where he did. I think the push, especially from local actors against quantitative measurement as a matter of principle, is important to note, and particularly the ways in which that's associated with neoliberalism, right? That what is valuable is what can be measured, but we know that not everything that's valuable can be measured. And quantitative over qualitative can sometimes lead to quantity over quality. So I think these criticisms and these pushbacks are important. And at the same time, we can't throw out the baby with the bathwater, right? The intention, if we're giving the benefit of the doubt, and there are certainly the political considerations that Mohammed noted in terms of domestic politics and so on. But if the intention is to ensure that this work is strategic, to examine its unintended consequences, to think critically about how to ensure that it is improving the situation for many populations and is inclusive and so on, then there needs to be that kind of reflective learning and critical analysis and accountability. Accountability both from the donors themselves to local partners and actors, and for those who are implementing the project, to those who are most vulnerable within their community. And so there needs to be a little bit of this holding of both, some of those quantitative aspects and qualitative aspects, and not necessarily seeing them as two distinct things as well, but understanding how they intermesh. One thing, Mohammed, that you said that I'm sort of noodling on was the work for interreligious dialogue and peace building was negatively impacted by COVID when funding dried up. And this is where I think sometimes the seeing that work as a niche subfield can be counterproductive for those reasons, but also with respect to impact, because then when budgets become tighter, those kinds of programs, are going to be cut because they're not necessarily seen as a priority for advancing goals. But where that as a method can be integrated into vaccination, public health kinds of issues, or education, or peace building, or so on, I think that's where we can ensure the sustainability of it, but also ensure that that these kinds of initiatives are leading to broader systemic and structural changes that are necessary, particularly in places where there is discrimination that's based on religion, that's based on gender, and multiple kinds of discrimination, where this kind of interreligious work can address those justice angles and those forms of inequitable sharing of resources or access to power. And then that simultaneously then then helps ensure that when funding is tight, and funding is really tight right now, we're going through forms of global recession right now, that kind of work isn't so fast, it can't be so easily carved out and then not funded.
Thank you, Susie. I'm noticing a few comments and questions. Thank you for sending those in. We will be turning to the audience for comment and question after a few more minutes. We'll do a few more questions with the panelists, and then we'll turn to you. I want to add something to the end of that question though as well, if I may use my moderator privileges. We have noticed overall that a lot of the evidence on religions and humanitarian development and peace is qualitative. And questions about religion often are better served by qualitative methods and methodologies, because we're talking about the fuzzy areas of life a lot of the time. But this does mean when we try and put forward an idea of the state of the evidence, some people will look at it and say there's not enough quantitative evidence here, and therefore maybe it doesn't count in these certain ways that we've been discussing. So there's this battle or tension between these two the quantitative qualitative ways of working, and that is something that impacts the way that our overall field of this religions and development and peace can be judged, because of the fact that we have a lot more qualitative evidence overall. And unfortunately, it means sometimes the evidence can be dismissed, even when we have really good research and really good information that is contextual, everything that's deep and contextual, everything that we've been talking about exists already. So it's something that affects us quite regularly when we're thinking about the state of the evidence in this area. Okay, so let's get on to our next questions, and then we can turn over to the audience. What order am I going to go into? I think for the sake of...
I do have a comment. Maybe I could say it throughout that question as well. Go ahead.
Well, so my next question is again leading on from things that we've already been talking about, which is what are the biases in the evidence base? So we've already mentioned, for example, that there was a lot of focus on Christianity and Islam earlier on. Maybe there's been a focus on certain geographic regions over others. So, what can we do to change some of those biases? What is missing because of these biases? Can we point out any more of the biases in the evidence base? So we'll start with you, Professor. Please go.
Thank you. Thank you. Olivia, I think it's important, what you added definitely regarding the tension between the qualitative and the quantitative. And, I'm sorry to revert to the professor here, but as I teach classes on methodology of evaluation and methodology in general, this is ongoing debate for one could say maybe over a century, at least 1 century, of quant versus qualitative. But the answer to it in many ways, it's not either or. I think the power of any evaluation is the combination, is what we call mixed methodology, where you look at both tools. To be able to understand a context, you have to have the larger tendencies, the numbers, but also you need to understand what does these numbers mean. Unfortunately, one of the main critique of many of the evaluation, and I told you, we just did one for 2.5 years, and we look at the numbers and said, okay, so what? How do you understand these numbers without a qualitative interview? So combination of those is one of the main answers that we want to take. Internally critique for our own interreligious peace community and in general peace community doing evaluation. Quite honestly, we don't have at this point yet enough or a cadre or people who can do interreligious peace building evaluation from within rather than from outside. From within, I mean, from somebody who understands the field itself and understand the faith, and rather than being only a sociologist or a psychologist or international relation expert who come in from outside the field and try to impose in the evaluation process those cookie cutter templates that are used in development or in humanitarian aid or in other aspects. Maybe this is one of the main needs of the field of interreligious peace building, is a training, capacity building in how to conduct evaluation of interreligious peace building in a way to identify what Olivia, you said, the distinctiveness of being a worker in this field or work in this area. That's a major issue. Let me just mention 2-3 points briefly about the biases. Anna mentioned the issue of Western biases in terms of, and also I think Susan mentioned that in the beginning, this Western hemisphere centric value of assumption domination in the field is a problematic. Again, that's the nature of the donors. Majority of the funds come from UK, the US, and France and Germany, European Union. These are the donor, and they tend to determine in many ways the criteria, the methodology, as well the general assessment. That's one major issue that we continue to struggle with. The second one is this cultural religious belief. I've been in evaluation in Sri Lanka and also in Mindanao and in Lebanon and in many other places where it's a struggle to convince an foreign evaluator like myself and even others in the value and importance of understanding the cultural and religious belief in the context where you operate. And those could be, in my view, crucial in overcoming that bias, is a crucial in delivering an evaluation with nuance, really that makes sense to the local, not only to the donor in the outside. English speaking is a problem. The fact that we always work with those who speak English or speak German or French, depending the language of the donor, and we attract it to them and work with them from a secular framework and only relate to religion as a symbolic way. These are major challenges that we have. In order not to be critical of it, the main thing is typical what we say in any class of development and peace building. Every evaluation should include, and in my view, majority of the team should be from the local context. And I would include in it usually members of the team who already implemented this project. And myself as an outsider, external, I am a consultant or only facilitator of the in a process that try to help to extract the nuance, success, and outcome or impact that was achieved. I am guided by the local cultural experts who are usually the people who lived the context and implemented the project. And I am not the expert on that context or the expert even in the methodology. I have some questions, I will pose them. And I think only through that inclusivity, through that holistic design, we are able to begin counter the effect of the cultural and religious factors on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go to Anna Maria.
Thank you. Professor Mohammed has mentioned most of the things, but I would like to highlight other points as well. It is true, Olivia, that we tend to focus on interreligious work between Muslims and Christians, especially in the MENA region, because up until recently we haven't, so we're still trying to understand that there are other religious components, other religious groups, ethnic components that should be involved in the process as well, mainly because the population in both of these countries is mostly Christian and Muslim. So sometimes we tend to forget other religious groups and all the efforts they are doing. For instance, if I take the Baha'i community in Lebanon or in Egypt or in Iraq, they do a lot on the level of humanitarian relief and developmental work. And most specifically, when we talk about interreligious collaboration, although it says religious or faith or belief, I do think that we sometimes also overlook other groups, such as those who do not identify with a certain religion, or agnostics or atheists. They do also play a part with faith-based institutions and with other faith-based actors. Those groups themselves, whether we're talking about majority, although I do not like to say majority, minority in this context, but those groups as majority and other groups as minorities can work together for the collection of data and evidence to better inform policies and projects. And I think just like any form of research, biases can be present in the collection of data. This could be due to several reasons, most of which were mentioned by Professor Muhammad, which is the unilateral perspectivity of the donor or international organization. So this Western perspective, the presence of majority religious groups, and sometimes this might skew the data a bit. The absence of different perspectives. Sometimes we forget to mention the gendered perspective, the people with disabilities perspective, the minorities perspective, and the bias of the data collector themselves, especially if we're talking about the Middle East, because sometimes faith-based actors might be politicized, might be instrumentalized, so anything can happen in the collection of data if those are not properly, if those people are not properly trained or properly followed up by someone else, because sometimes it's hard for them to detach themselves from the reality that they are part of. I also think that there could be a lot of evidence other than in English that are most of the times overlooked or even non-funded. So when we do try to do a research in a different language or even an evaluation in a different language, this might not get funding as easily as a project done in English. For instance, I would just like to give an example here that is not related to state of evidence or meal, but we have a project at Adyan Foundation which is related to the situation of violations and best practices on freedom of religion and belief in the MENA region. And part of the rationale behind this project is to have, because we do not have enough access to information in Arabic or from researchers from the region, we are able to start a new hub on the situation of freedom of religion and belief in the MENA region, specifically focusing on 6 countries. So because people need this access to information in another language, and this is why I like when JII used the term decolonizing knowledge, because this is also done when we try to have more research, more evidence in a language other than English, not to dismiss the wonderful work that has been done in the English language and the universality of it, but to highlight that sometimes using the local language, words and narratives is important to achieve or to get better results.
Susie?
Yeah, I want to reinforce something Mohammed said with reference to a participant put a note about the everyday peace indicators in the chat box. And I think, what Mohammed was saying about the importance of local actors and the beneficiaries defining what success looks like at the outset before conducting any kind of an evaluation, collecting evidence based on their indicators of success is incredibly important. In EPI, I was involved in some work in Sri Lanka and elsewhere at USIP where we were using the EPI indicators in order to have the local communities define what the indicators of success would look like for all of the organizations that were then getting funding through USAID's SCORE project in Sri Lanka with respect to reconciliation. So I think there's a lot to offer there. One thing I just want to reinforce that I said earlier is that I think it's particularly important for the most vulnerable members of the community to be defining what success looks like too. Based on my own experiences going into places like Colombia and so on, that there may have been, for example, women who looked at some of the interreligious efforts that had been done in the past and would give a sort of negative assessment of the impact of those projects based on their priorities for what constitutes peace and what constitutes nonviolence or anti-violence work, which may have been different than the kind of interreligious efforts that they were seeing that were being sort of defined a lot of times by the institutional heads of the churches, which were predominantly male. And you can apply that across the board, as Anna was speaking to. So I think it is important to also ensure, even locally, who are the ones who are defining what success looks like, and is that being inclusive. And then one other thing, I just want to go even sort of deeper in thinking about the very epistemologies that that are operational in defining evidence, or how we get to evidence, or how impact is made. And so, for example, I think there's a lot of linear thinking within the field about how we measure impact, about how impact happens. And linear thinking like that is very comfortable for me as an American Christian, right? But it's not necessarily the dominant way of understanding or assessing for a lot of other cultural and religious traditions. And again, I think this is where the greater inclusion of particularly indigenous worldviews and traditions and ways of thinking and ways of being can help push against or broaden the aperture of understanding both what evidence is and how to evaluate the impact, and how these kinds of impacts, what the sort of ripple effect of different kinds of initiatives can be beyond just measuring the impact from point A to point B.
Thank you all three. We have come to the top of the hour, and we still have a third of the panel left, but I do want to shortly go to the rest of the audience for their comments and questions. So I guess I will just ask one final question, if you can summarize your thoughts relatively quickly, is what are you excited about? What emerging evidence is forthcoming? So what's going to be, maybe in your opinion, the next wave of exciting new information we'll find out from research and learning that's happening at the moment? What are the trends that are arising, and what are you excited about for evidence in this field? Susie, maybe we'll start with you. I'm just going backwards for the first time now.
Well, I mean, I think I've already said it. I don't know that I would add anything to what I said before, but I think, again, the inclusion of indigenous traditions and cultures under that category of religion pushes against a lot of the operating assumptions and norms that in ways that I think are really generative and creative, and potentially sort of revolutionary in some ways, and thinking about how we do this stuff, and particularly helpful to that work of decolonizing that we've mentioned. So I'm excited about that.
Professor?
Yeah, thank you. I will pick up from Susan as well. I mean, it's not only in our field, but I think in general, social sciences, international relations right now, social work, psychology, everybody is going in many ways facing the Black Lives Matters aftermath in some ways. So the concept of decolonization research and how it affects the work in religion and interreligious peace building is something exciting to see it unfold. And it is exciting to see voices work like done by Adian, as Anna mentioned, in terms of the hub in the MENA region, and something like that, I think, to be replicated in other places. So, but again, I don't think we're inventing the wheel here, because this is exactly what participatory development went through in the late 60s, early 70s, when they shifted from modernization theory into participatory contextual development work, and they basically changed lots of the development practices. I am hoping our field of interreligious peace building and peace building in general will take those concepts and these frameworks seriously, and will not be bent or adjust itself to continue to adjust itself to the agenda imposed on many of us in the field by the donor-driven proposal, donor-driven RFPs, and many of these PR-driven projects of interreligious peace building. And I have had a number of those in my long career in this. My second exciting point has to do with virtual reality. The virtuality that I've learned from COVID impact, like many others like you, that many of the peace building work can be done virtually like we're doing now. And I'm really intrigued to see our field and our impact assessment and our evaluation managing to adjust itself and also relate to the impact of technology and the capacity of conducting our business through virtual technology, and also to be critical enough to realize that peace building and face-to-face is also component of those, are also essential for producing impact and producing effect and building relationships among people. They can be built through virtual, but I think we still need to bring in the face-to-face component. These things we struggle with it, and I'm excited about the next phase of looking at them. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna Maria. You'll see as well, we've been joined by Dr. Frederick Ogenga, and we'll pass to him shortly, but Anna Maria, your closing ideas.
Yes, as was previously mentioned, I can see, we can all see that there are a lot of individual, academic, and institutional efforts to try to understand more how to properly measure the impact of interreligious efforts in humanitarian development and peace activities. However, I will be biased here and talk about the wonderful work that Adyan Foundation has been doing, because it can be replicated in other organizations as well, whether in Lebanon or in the MENA region, because the foundation has been developing its meal capacities through a comprehensive plan for the past 2 to 3 years. And we were able this year to develop an evaluation program, which is called Activity Info, where all project managers are able to insert their log frames, their indicators, their stories of change. And I think this responds to the challenge that we were previously speaking of, finding this balance between quantitative and qualitative. If I have 70% participation of women, however, did any of these women participate or share their ideas in this roundtable discussion? So finding this balance and seeing the information or the results would better help us analyze and implement future projects. We are also training other individuals and organizations on different methods of data collection, including our beneficiaries, most of which are faith-based actors or faith-based institutions, such as how to write survey in a language that is local, that is understood by the communities, how to conduct focus groups in each of the different governorates, because you know, needs are different, nuances are different, and how to collect stories of change. And there's something really exciting regarding the language that we were talking about, is that we are also in the process of finalizing a glossary on meal terms in different Arabic dialects, including Lebanese, Egyptian, Tunisian, Yemeni, and Iraqi. So we would think that all of these Arabic-speaking countries would have the same terminology, but even the terminology is different. So this highlights the importance of inclusivity through language as well, and through a narrative that is understood by all. Mind you that some also are non-Arabic speakers, so this would be maybe the next step to develop something that is related to the whole groups, religious, ethnic, or linguistic in the Middle East.
Thank you, Anna Maria. You're doing exciting work, and we'll be watching closely for those results of that work. So I will pass now to Dr. Frederick Ogenga, if he's there and can hear us. We thank you for joining us, even though I know you've been in between pieces of travel. So Dr. Ogenga is also, you can see his bio in the chat, but he's also the academic chair of the JLI Learning Hub on local governance, peace building, and local faith actors in East Africa. And he's just completing the initial stages of a scoping study on that question: governance, peace building, and local faith actors. And we'd like to invite him to speak briefly on some of the initial findings of that scoping study. Dr. Ogenga, over to you.
Thank you so much. I think I hope you can all hear me clearly. I've really put on my microphone. Well, I will go very quickly because we don't have time. I will start with a hypothesis. Our hypothesis was premised on the fact that that faith actors are doing tremendously well in terms of peace building in East Africa, yet their work is not being appraised, and it remains disjointed when it comes to how they could collaborate with others in the area, like academics, civil society, and state agencies like policymakers, as well as the evidence generation. And what is fascinating really when we do, so we did some methodologies. We combined some methodology, we triangulated where we used institutional and desk approach. Then we also use key informant interviews and focus group discussion. Well, the key informant, I mean, the desk and institutional analysis really reveals some key local institutions and local actors that are actually at the forefront of peace building interventions in the area, yet their work remains unnoticed. So our study is called Bridging the Gaps, appraising the voices of local faith actors in matters peace building, religion, and governance. Well, what we are finding out preliminarily is that there's a lot of evidence by local actors, yeah, but that evidence is sitting somewhere in the shelves of either university libraries, sitting in archives, sitting in a book somewhere or a journal article. And yet after that study, after these studies, nobody's really keen on taking that into practice. So there's a big gap between theory and practice, which as far as local evidence creation is concerned, and also local interventions. So our program, our study really used a decolonial approach, where we looked at local actors, local institutions, what are they doing, what are the successes, what are their weaknesses, and so on and so forth. What since we knew the major weakness is implementation and practice, we used the Joint Learning Initiative East Africa Hub as the forum for knowledge sharing, exchange of information and ideas, and also learning. So that again became our focus group discussion object of analysis. So with one of those key monthly listening dialogues, we engage the members because it's about engagement, it's about inclusion, it's about bringing everybody on board. And with that, I would want to use one case study to really emphasize on why we are taking that approach. It's not a new approach, by the way. One case study on looking at radicalization and violence extremism in Kenya and Zanzibar really made some excellent recommendations regarding
We can't hear you so well. Can you, maybe your microphone's changed place? Can you hear us?
excellent recommendation. Yes. Somebody just interfered with my headphones when I was alive.
No worries.
The devil is seriously working here. It doesn't want peace. But thanks God we are faith actors. So inshallah. Well, so the case study reveals that in fact, people who are at the core of the peace building and polarization problem on the grassroots, whether it's about violent extremism, whether it's about ethnicity related to politics, and so on and so forth, are largely the youth. If you look at the proportion of youth and women, you see the youth are leading there. Women are also, young women, I mean by that. So if you look at the gender matrix, you'll see young men ahead of women in terms of causing violence and in terms of building peace. So the argument in this paper is that that nothing much is being done. Nothing much is being done regarding the role of the youth. These men and women when it comes to their positive capacities of building peace. Well, and the recommendations they're making is that programs that are geared towards peace building should emphasize on first of all co-creation at the grassroots. This is after mapping local evidence to agree on what really is a problem. After the co-creation, then there's co-ownership. The idea of co-ownership and the aspect of cooperation. And this cooperation is not just the youth alone, it's a multi-stakeholder cooperation. So in this case, we realize that faith actors are actually at the core of this intervention that I'm talking about, particularly on violent extremism in Kenya and Zanzibar. But then we see a missing element in terms of other actors like state agencies, and academia. Although we are noticing that in fact, these faith institutions hired consultants who are academics. So the report is produced by consultants who are actually academically oriented. And they produced a fantastic report that then they are using to make recommendations that can be implemented. When it comes to the role of state agencies in all that complex, the paper seems to be lacking proper ways of engaging the state, because it just says that in all these interventions, whether it's community dialogues, whether it's peer-to-peer training, whether it's workshops, whether it's online events, whether it's cultural activity event, you know, for knowledge dissemination and also changing the public discourse. They are saying the state should participate, should be involved by religious leaders in those activities, but they don't recommend how. And that brings us back to the problem we have. I can tell you for sure that in this study, I found out that getting state officers, state officers, policymakers, to jump into just participating even in a key informant interview is like Kenya going to the moon. You might want to figure that out. And it's really, you have to press them, you have to pressure them. So I think, for me, I think the biggest culprit here is individuals who are supposed to formulate policies are sitting at level of authority. You can't do interventions without them, like violent extremism. In Kenya, if you want to do an intervention of violent extremism, you'll be arrested. They will ask you, who are you? Are you radicalizing others or not? But so people like us who are collaborating with the National Counterterrorism Center, which is in the Ministry of Interior, based in the Office of the President, have to seek partnership with state agencies before we can pretend that you are doing any intervention on the ground on violent extremism. And that is, there's some level of bureaucracy there. We managed to crack into those spaces because of person-to-person relations of the usual arena of doing things. And perhaps that's why the importance of networking, because I met these key stakeholders in a networking session. They saw my efforts as an individual and they capitalized that. So I'm actually a resource person for the National Counterterrorism Center. And that is all that we need. So we are hoping that after we get all this evidence, then our challenge is now, how do we use it to change and shape policy out there so that it can make a practical impact on people who these things matter on the ground. These are the youth, these are the marginalized, these are women, these are people who are disenfranchised, these are gay, lesbian, and whatever, you know, all these groups of people, because they are all human beings at the end of the day. And no one has a right to point fingers. We have to be inclusive in our interventions so that we are stronger in the inclusivity. And that's why our philosophy is anchored on a Pan-African value of Utu, Umoja, and Arambe. Utu simply means pulling together humanity. Umoja means pulling together of collective responsibility. And Arambe is actually, no, Umoja means unity. And Arambe means collective responsibility. So that is the driving philosophy as we move forward with the JLI. And we are hoping that they have the technology, I mean, the virtual hub itself.
Dr. Ogenga, we can't hear you very well again, I'm afraid. I think the microphone's being
affected. Can you hear
affected.
me now?
Yes, we can. We also need to move on to our Q&A, I'm afraid, now. So if you could just give us your last sentence summary, thank you.
I'm done.
Okay, thank you very, very much. So I think we've picked up all these ideas about
we are hoping to leverage on. Sorry, I was just giving my last sentence.
Oh, go ahead.
We are hoping to leverage on technology so that we can spread we can change the public discourse and we can share our ideas in East Africa and beyond. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you for joining us while you're traveling. So that study will be forthcoming, and I hope that you'll look up the JLI website to see when that comes out, so we can learn more about peace building, governance, and local faith actors in East Africa. So we have some minutes now for Q&A. I see we've had questions and answers in the chat. I see Michelle, I see John, I see Isha. So we will be now turning to those. If anyone else has other questions, please either raise your hand or put your question in the Q&A box. We'll turn to Michelle first, if Michelle is still here. I didn't check that, but if the organizers can unmute Michelle if she's still here, please. Go ahead, Michelle.
Hi, well, I didn't know that we were going to be unmuted, so greetings, everyone. There's just so much goodness to comment on in this presentation, but to circle back to what I posed a few minutes ago, I just was really intrigued by the creative tension between Susan's mention of, the potential unhelpfulness of overemphasizing the distinction between religious and secular actors, with which I totally agree. And at the same time, Anna Maria is pointing out that if we were, and forgive me if I'm paraphrasing incorrectly, you can correct me, but if we were to rely exclusively on mainstream research approaches and use them the same way with everyone, that would actually be quite problematic, because most of those mainstream approaches are very westernized and secular. So there needs to be some way to adapt to the worldviews of the participants. And as I've struggled with that myself a lot in recent years, I've kind of centered in on the practice of cultural responsiveness and learning about and adapting to the worldview of the stakeholders involved in the process, whatever it may be. And so I suppose the bigger question is just, looking for further comment and insight on that tension. And as a sub question of that, wondering if you see any potential in the practice of trying to be consistently culturally responsive.
Who would like to take that question?
I'd be happy to start. Michelle, it's wonderful to hear your voice and to see your face, at least the snapshot of it. Thank you for the question. One thing I just want to clarify when I'm talking about my concern about reifying a distinction between the secular and the religious, one of the things I'm getting at there, I'm sort of drawing from this really rich collection of scholarship. And actually my co-author, Erin Wilson, has written on that a lot. But there's been a lot of pushback against the idea that you can create these kind of two distinct categories. And in fact, looking at the ways in which what we define as the secular, when you begin to dig a little deeper, it's not neutral towards religion, and it's not even a-religious. That oftentimes Talal Asad and some others have done some writing that what we consider the secular is often at root sort of Protestant Christian norms, or have been shaped largely by Protestant Christian norms of justice and equality and fairness and rightness and so on. So that's my concern, and sort of that when we use this uncritical set of categories of the secular, the religious, and then reify them through the ways in which we engage in this field or talk in this field, we might actually be kind of letting this understanding of the secular as a-religious or as neutral towards religious prevail. And also then, again, some of the European Enlightenment ways in which, in defining the secular as it emerged during that process and was used to legitimate the new modern state, what was secular was considered rational good, helpful for prosperity, for peace, for development, and so on. And that was what's considered religious was backwards, archaic, inevitably a hurdle towards development and prosperity and so on. So I'm sort of drawing from that scholarship and just making a nod to it when I say that we need to be careful about this. And one of the things I'm concerned about with thinking about religious, quote unquote, everything in square quotes at Harvard, but quote unquote religious peace building as a distinct field and then requiring distinct forms of evaluation is that we're then setting the standard as like secular peace building, and the methods and evaluation of secular peace building, religious peace building needs to be able to fit under that umbrella in ways that sort of privilege the secular over the religious again. Okay, so that was kind of academic, but one thing I want to say about this cultural responsiveness is that I think it's really great. I mean, the work that I do at Harvard is about religious literacy, which is more largely about cultural literacy, which is understanding how the very norms and assumptions that are operating in a local context are going to be distinctive and particular to that context. And what I think, and this gets a little bit to what Frederic was saying too, and I'm glad that he was able to join us for a bit, and that my hope, and this is part of the, again, move towards decolonizing generally within development and more broadly, but my hope is that the work of evidence can be less about ensuring that these local organizations and efforts are being shaped by the norms and the standards of the international system, which might not be relevant to that context or foreign to that context, but more that evidence can be used in order to ensure that the power wielders in the international system are being held accountable to the local actors and organizations. And so that's where I think things like everyday peace indicators or cultural, making sure that things are culturally responsive, thinking about accountability with respect to the marginalized groups, as I was speaking about earlier, and as Frederic was speaking about as well, or about the African norms that he was speaking about as the standards by which to determine success and to design projects and so on. I think that's helpful in pushing the international system to be more accountable to local actors and shaping the international system in ways that will hopefully be more just, less colonial, and so on.
Thanks, Susie. So we don't have much time, so I apologize that we won't be able to get to everything with everybody. I would encourage the attendees, audience, to go and look at the Q&A. There's lots of different comments there, including some links to people's work that you might want to see. And so that is a good place to look through for some comments and questions. I'm going to pick up one final question that I've seen in the Q&A as unfortunately, it says anonymous, so I don't know who sent it in, but thank you to whoever sent it in, about how do we build not just the skills, but also the culture of evidence generation and use, especially when the understanding of what evidence is can sometimes differ. So I'll put this to everyone on the panel, and this will be our final question about building a culture of evidence. Anna Maria, if you would like to speak to that.
Yes, this is really interesting because I think the culture of evidence and of trying to monitor or evaluate a certain project to ensure its sustainability is something relatively new in the region. And I think part of what JLI is doing and other organizations, local organizations such as Adyan, is it is true that it is trying to build the skills of these implementers or of these local leaders, but at the same time, as the question was saying, building the culture of helping people understand that finding evidence, doing research, doing monitoring and evaluation is important. And I think part of how to do that is to try to convince them that if we do it ourselves, if we do it in a participatory manner, in an inclusive manner, if we listen to them, what they consider as evidence, what they consider as needs, what they consider as results, then this culture will automatically build and create a snowball effect. So in my opinion, if we're talking about working with faith-based actors or organizations in Lebanon, for instance, this culture will be built naturally when people feel involved in the process itself and not only feel as recipients.
Professor?
Thank you. I guess, I mean, like what Anna said, as well as Susie, it is important to move toward culture of evidence, and maybe that's a term of accountability that has been used by donors initially. So I would like to de-link the push to culture of evidence from the pressure of the donors to show me where did the money go, one, and accountability in terms not only finance, although it's done in primary finance. And I want to also make sure that we think of building relationships as important evidence, as opposed to contradictory to concrete evidence, because in many ways, culture of evidence decrease or neglect the emphasis on building relationships and emphasize, again, the quantitative, emphasize the concrete, tangible, task-oriented to be accomplished. And that itself, we know it's coming from a different cultural framework and cultural orientation that has dictated bureaucracy, capitalism, and Protestant ethics of work, if we want to trace it back all the way to the 1600 in terms of development of state, nation state, and so forth. So for me, yes, it's possible, and we should go for a state of evidence, culture of evidence, as long as we de-link it from all the other things that have caused us to go through the process of colonization and now be with the decolonization. So yes, for the culture of evidence, but to be inclusive, to be based organic, to be from within. And as I said earlier, we in this field are not inventing this. We should go back to the 70s and look how development, healthcare, and others went through the same process of participatory development and participatory engagement as well. And finally, we're not looking for new things to use to evaluate or to make the peace building and religion distinct from all other fields. No, we're looking for areas in which we can capture the distinctiveness using similar, in addition to what needed a new technique, a new processes, a new design to capture the uniqueness of saying inshallah, or the uniqueness of bringing your faith at work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. And we are at the end of the session now. There has been some discussion in the Q&A. Several people putting forward their own websites, for example. So again, just encouraging you to look at that, to see other resources, and there's been all the resources shared in the chat. So a lot of evidence for you to go and look at and consider after this this session. Thank you very much to everyone participating. Thank you to our audience and our panelists and the organizers. You have heard about the state of the evidence. I'll leave it up to your own opinions to figure out what you think the state of the evidence is, but we've certainly heard some key messages about contextualization, about mixed methods, about bringing up evidence from the people that are actually doing the work. And so I hope that we'll all take some of those messages away and into the rest of the conference today. So thank you very much, everyone, and hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.